"Get out! We don't serve people like you!" The cafe owner's icy shout rang out as Marcus Reed, a black former Navy SEAL, stepped inside, simply wanting a cup of coffee and a moment of peace. He left quietly, but the insult did not end there. The next day, the entire unit of veterans who had once fought beside him arrived. Without uniforms, their disciplined aura and battle-hardened eyes alone made the air grow heavy. The cafe fell silent, and Ethan Clark, the owner, suddenly felt his heart pound wildly. For their arrival signaled consequences no one could have foreseen. Marcus Reed had grown used to long silences after leaving the service. 20 years in the Navy SEALs had trained him to observe quietly rather than speak much. That day, on a coastal street in the town of Harborview, he decided to step into a cafe with a bright name, Seaside Brew. All he wanted was a black coffee, a quiet space to set aside the noisy memories in his head. But the very moment he walked through the glass door, that silence was disturbed by the stares of others. Ethan Clark, the young owner, prided himself on the modern style he had painstakingly built. His cafe usually welcomed tourists, trendy young people, those who loved taking photos and enjoying a clean, stylish, curated atmosphere. And in Ethan's eyes, the black man in a faded t-shirt, worn shoes, and a sun-bleached cap did not fit that image. From behind the counter, Ethan cast a prejudiced glance at Marcus, judgment written all over his face even before a word was spoken. Marcus chose a table near the window, where he could see every entrance and exit, a habit that never left him since his soldiering days. He sat down, ordered a plain black coffee, and stayed still, his eyes sometimes drifting toward the sea, sometimes resting on the ceiling fan. He made no noise, drew no attention beyond his mere presence. Yet that very presence irritated Ethan. After a few moments of hesitation, Ethan left the counter and approached Marcus's table with a polite smile but a cold voice. "Sorry, this spot is usually for tourists or groups of young people. I hope you understand, my cafe has its own style." The words sounded courteous, but the emphasis made the exclusion clear. Marcus looked up, his eyes calm yet marked by experience. He replied simply, "I just want a cup of coffee." Ethan didn't back away. His gaze kept sizing Marcus up, as if saying his presence was an inconvenience. He pressed on. "I understand, but this cafe is meant to have a modern, clean atmosphere, suited for travelers. I'm afraid this might not be the right place." That even-toned voice was an invisible blade, cutting deeper into the divide. A few young customers in the corner began to notice. One discreetly raised a phone to record. Marcus remained still, resting his hand on the table, his voice low but firm. "Who do you think I am? Did I come here to cause trouble? I only wanted some quiet, but maybe even quiet has to fit your style here." The words echoed, pulling the air tight inside the cafe. Ethan faltered for a moment but tried to hold firm. "I didn't mean it that way. It's just, the cafe needs a consistent image. If you don't mind, I think you should leave. I don't want to call security, but I will if I must." At that moment, Marcus looked straight into Ethan's eyes. There was no anger, only a heavy silence. The same silence that once hung over life or death moments on the battlefield. It made Ethan uneasy, his heart pounding faster, though he tried to mask it with coldness. Marcus gently set the untouched coffee cup back on the table, placed a few bills beside it, and stood up. Without another word, he walked out the glass door. As it closed behind him, a thick silence lingered. The customers remained, but none laughed or chatted as before. All of them had just witnessed something wrong, yet no one dared to speak up. In those few brief moments, Marcus Reed had been turned into someone who didn't belong, judged only by his skin color and simple appearance. But he did not lash out or argue. His silence was the strongest voice of all, a voice without words, yet heavy enough to leave a weight in the minds of everyone present. And from that moment, the small clash in a small cafe had planted the seed of a much larger story, one the whole town would soon be talking about. The small rented room on the second floor of an old inn in Harborview was where Marcus Reed returned after that tense afternoon. He sat down on a creaky wooden chair, took off his faded baseball cap, placed it on the table, and stared quietly into the emptiness. For 20 years in the military, he had faced gunfire, death at arm's length, and the loss of comrades. Yet never had he felt as heavy as when he was rejected for nothing more than his skin color and appearance in an ordinary cafe. Marcus pulled out his old phone and opened the Brotherhood Navy SEALs group chat, the thread where his brothers-in-arms had kept in touch since leaving the service. His fingers typed a short line. Seaside Brew, Café in Harborview. Owner didn't want to serve me because I didn't fit the image of the place. That's all. No extra explanation, no anger, just a dry message. After sending it, he set the phone down, leaned back in the chair, and closed his eyes. He wasn't expecting replies, nor defense. He just wanted to forget. But the world outside wasn't as silent as he was. A clip a young customer had casually recorded inside the cafe had already started spreading across local social media. At first, just a few dozen shares, then quickly hundreds. On Twitter, the hashtag #JusticeForMarcus appeared, followed by outraged posts. A veteran kicked out just because of his skin color? This country owes them more than this. Why can someone who once defended freedom not have the freedom to sit and drink a cup of coffee? In Harborview, small bars, seaside convenience stores, even the local high school started buzzing with talk. Some felt shame, others anger. A widowed old woman who had lost her son in the war sat before her old TV screen, sighed, and whispered, "Men like him don't need parades. They just need a place to sit." Marcus had no idea that while he struggled to find sleep, his silence had already become the spark igniting a growing wave. He was not as alone as he thought, and it was that very quietness that would soon bring familiar footsteps back to stand beside him, in a way the entire town would never have expected. The next morning, Harborview seemed the same as always. The salty sea breeze rustled through the palms, waves lapped against the worn shore. Shopkeepers lifted their shutters, readying for another peaceful day. No one knew that this peace was about to be broken, not by gunfire or chaos, but by a presence so silent it made the entire street hold its breath. Near midday, 3 black pickup trucks pulled up at the end of the seaside road. No sirens, no noise, just doors opening almost in unison. Out stepped middle-aged men in plain clothes, dark shirts, jeans, boots. They didn't need uniforms to be recognized. The way they stood tall, walked with unshakable steadiness, and swept the street with seasoned eyes was enough for anyone perceptive to know what they once were. At the front was Samuel Turner, Marcus's close comrade and the leader of the SEAL veterans. At 46, he still carried a powerful frame, his eyes sharp, cold, and steady. Beside him stood Derek Cole, towering, broad-shouldered like a wall, streaks of gray in his hair, eyes as sharp as blades. Following was Anthony Morales, smaller but quick, his eyes alert, a backpack slung loosely over one shoulder, the cool head of the group. And then 9 more men, each distinct in appearance, yet marked by the same aura, silent, solid, unmistakably battle-tested. They didn't march like soldiers, but spread out through the town as if on a covert operation. Samuel and 2 others headed straight for Seaside Brew. Derek leaned against the gas station nearby, lighting a cigarette as his eyes scanned the street. Anthony slipped into a bakery, buying a few fresh baguettes, though his gaze never strayed far from the cafe. The rest positioned themselves along the street, forming an invisible ring around the block. The townspeople began to notice. They didn't chatter, didn't question, but every glance followed the men who appeared too coordinated to be ordinary strangers. A few tourists pulled out their phones to record, but froze when Derek's cold stare cut their way. No one dared to approach. Inside Seaside Brew, Ethan Clark was behind the counter. After yesterday's incident, the young owner still believed he had done the right thing. To him, keeping the cafe clean and modern was justification enough to refuse service to a man he deemed out of place. He had no idea that his decision had set off a chain reaction he could no longer control. The glass door shivered as Samuel pushed it open. He entered alone, but through the windows Ethan could clearly see the others outside, scattered, moving like the pieces of a formation trained to surround. Samuel paused at the threshold, his gaze sweeping the cafe, then gave a faint nod as greeting. He didn't need an introduction. His presence spoke for him. The atmosphere dipped heavy. A young couple in the corner fell silent, watching intently. A barista unconsciously slowed their steps. Ethan suddenly felt short of breath without knowing why. He failed to realize he was standing at the center of an invisible circle. Every glance, every step outside focused on him. Samuel approached the counter slowly, his voice deep, steady, and calm. "Black coffee, no sugar." Ethan nodded, his hands clumsier than usual as he worked the machine. Sweat beaded on his forehead, though the air conditioning hummed steadily. In that moment he felt something shift, as if the cafe no longer belonged to him. Outside, the others held their positions patiently. No words, no smiles, just the steady presence of men bound by discipline. It wasn't preparation for an attack, it was a silent declaration. Marcus Reed would never stand alone. Samuel Turner stepped into Seaside Brew with a calm yet unwavering demeanor. He walked to the counter, signaling for a black coffee, no sugar. Ethan Clark met his gaze, his heart thudding in his chest. There was something about this middle-aged man that unsettled him. It wasn't a threat of action, but a kind of authority that needed no weapon. The cup of coffee was placed in front of Samuel. He didn't rush to sip it. Instead, he slowly turned the cup in his hand, his eyes never leaving Ethan. "The man you kicked out yesterday is our brother," Samuel said, his voice rough but clear. "He once risked his life in open waters to drag a white child out of gunfire. He shielded his comrades, stood at the edge of life and death without flinching. And you? Yesterday you drove him out just because of his skin color and a worn-out shirt?" The room fell heavy. A few customers glanced up, confusion and curiosity flickering in their eyes. A server froze mid-step, too tense to move. Ethan stumbled over his words, trying to keep his voice steady. I didn't mean to insult him. I just wanted to keep the cafe's image. I wasn't..." "Wasn't?" Samuel cut in, his eyes drilling coldly into him. "You think your so-called image is more important than the honor of a man who once wore the uniform? You think skin color decides who deserves to sit here?" Sweat ran down Ethan's temple. He wanted to argue, to insist it was a misunderstanding, but the words stuck in his throat. Just then, the cafe door opened. Derek Cole, towering like a wall, stepped inside, followed by Anthony Morales. They said nothing, only sat at the window table, the very spot Marcus Reed had been forced to leave the day before. That gesture alone turned Ethan's excuses into ashes. The cafe went silent. A few tourists exchanged looks, realizing they were witnessing something significant. Chloe, the young waitress, clutched her tray with trembling hands, her eyes fixed on the veterans with a mix of awe and unease. Samuel set his coffee back on the counter, his voice steady yet striking like a hammer. "Men like Marcus Reed don't need parades. They only need to sit and drink a cup of coffee like anyone else. A quiet seat, the bare minimum of respect. But you took even that away." Ethan opened his mouth, but no sound came out. Samuel's gaze stayed locked on him, as heavy as a silent verdict. Outside, more veterans could be seen through the glass, stationed along the street, reminders that this was not one man's matter, but the weight of a brotherhood, of history itself. Anthony Morales, smaller in build but sharp-eyed, rose and placed a card on the counter. "Veterans Support Network," he said flatly. "We didn't come here to cause trouble. But if a man who fought for this flag isn't respected in his own country, that shame doesn't belong only to a cafe. It belongs to the whole community." The customers held their breath. An elderly patron nodded slowly, eyes shining with agreement. Ethan stood frozen, fists clenched, his shame laid bare. No shouting, no threats, just disciplined silence, harsher than any curse. Samuel rose, gave a slight nod, signaling to his men. A few more veterans entered, sitting at empty tables without a word. Their very presence, straight-backed, silent, unyielding, was enough to turn Seaside Brew into a place where no one dared breathe too loudly. In that moment, Ethan Clark realized he wasn't facing a handful of difficult customers. He was facing an entire unit of men who had once been ready to give their lives for the country. And the price of his disrespect came not through yelling or violence, but through this crushing silence, a silence heavier than any sentence. That gloomy afternoon gave way to a storm of information that swept across Harborview. The clip showing the SEAL veterans sitting silently inside Seaside Brew spread like wildfire on social media. Within hours, Twitter and Facebook were flooded with the hashtag #JusticeForMarcus, accompanied by thousands of furious comments. A man who once risked his life to defend this flag was kicked out just because of his skin color. "This is America?" one prominent account wrote. That cafe didn't just insult one man, it insulted everyone who sacrificed. Local TV stations jumped in quickly. The evening news opened with footage of Seaside Brew, a bold headline scrolling across the screen. "Harborview Controversy. Former SEAL Denied Service." A reporter stood outside the cafe, voice stern. "Residents of Harborview are questioning discrimination and a lack of respect toward veterans. Owner Ethan Clark has yet to release an official statement." Tourists began canceling reservations, and locals quietly warned each other to avoid Seaside Brew. Once bustling, the cafe had become desolate. Chairs that used to be packed now sat empty, the bar cold, employees standing idle with nothing to do. Ethan Clark, once a proud owner, now faced reproachful stares from the very townspeople who once supported him. His phone buzzed non-stop, messages, emails, angry comments. Some close friends urged him to issue a public apology, but Ethan clung stubbornly to the belief that he had done the right thing to protect the cafe's image. Yet every time he recalled Samuel Turner's eyes, Derek's silence, Anthony's steady gaze, his confidence crumbled. It wasn't anger that haunted him, it was that heavy silence, as though he had already been sentenced. On the third day after the incident, Ethan stood alone in the empty cafe. Outside, townsfolk passed by, but no one stepped in. A few local newspapers left on the tables carried bold headlines: "A cup of coffee and a lesson in respect." He picked one up, reading word by word, cold sweat sliding down his back. He realized the crisis had spun far beyond his control. This was no longer about one customer. It was about justice, honor, and how society recognizes sacrifice. In his despair, Ethan remembered Anthony's words left with the business card. "We didn't come here to cause trouble, but if a man who fought for this flag isn't respected in his own country, that shame belongs not just to one cafe, it belongs to the entire community." The sentence echoed like a bell. That night, Ethan sat at the counter, his phone lying on the table. He opened his contacts, trembling fingers searching for Marcus Reed's number that Samuel had left behind. His mind wrestled with fear. If he called, he would have to face that cold silence once more. If he didn't, he would remain a coward forever. The phone's glow reflected off his pale face. At last, he pressed call. The long dial tone stretched time thin. Each second sent Ethan's heart racing faster. Then came a calm, steady voice. "This is Marcus." It was as if nothing had ever shaken him. Ethan swallowed hard, his voice cracking. "This is Ethan Clark, owner of Seaside Brew. I'm calling to say, I'm sorry." The words didn't erase his mistake. They didn't instantly bring customers back. But for the first time, Ethan admitted the truth. He had been wrong, and only by facing it could he hope for redemption. That night, in the empty cafe, a turning point quietly unfolded, turning the page to a new chapter in the story. A week later, Marcus Reed stepped back into Seaside Brew. This time, he wore a neat button-down shirt, his hair combed smooth, his steps slow but steady. Not because he wanted to prove anything, but because he wanted to see for himself whether the place had truly changed. The glass door swung open, sunlight from the sea poured in, and there was Ethan Clark, waiting behind the counter. The young owner's face no longer carried the pride it once did, only caution and a fragile determination. Ethan personally carried out a black coffee, no sugar, and set it down with both hands on the table by the window, the very spot Marcus had been forced to leave that day. "This coffee isn't just for drinking," Ethan said, his voice tight with emotion. "It's the deepest apology I can offer." Marcus didn't answer right away. He lifted the cup, breathed in the aroma, then took a slow sip. His eyes rose to meet Ethan's. "I don't need to be respected as a hero," he said quietly. "I just need to be treated fairly, like any other customer." The cafe staff stood nearby, nodding silently. From that day forward, they understood their work wasn't only to serve coffee, but to serve respect and kindness. On the wall hung a small wooden plaque Ethan had put up. "Veterans Table, a seat of honor for those who served quietly." No names, no fanfare, just a reminder of sacrifices that should never be forgotten. Marcus's story soon became a local legend in Harborview. Tourists came not just for coffee, but to see the place where a powerful lesson had been learned. People whispered that one old soldier had changed an entire cafe, not through anger or force, but through silence and dignity. And so, Harborview gained a new symbol, small yet profound. Each time someone sat by the window, they remembered that fairness and kindness are never luxuries. A cup of coffee, a glance, an invitation to sit, sometimes those are the greatest recognitions of all. Respect does not diminish us, it makes us greater. From that day on, Seaside Brew was no longer just a trendy photo spot, but a place where people came to learn how to see others with the heart. Never be quick to judge someone by their skin color, clothing, or outward appearance. Behind silence may lie a lifetime of service, sacrifices we may never fully know. Respect is not a luxury. It's a basic right every person deserves. A simple greeting, an equal glance, a cup of coffee offered with sincerity, sometimes that is how we affirm human dignity. Kindness does not make us smaller, it makes us greater. If you believe kindness and respect can change an entire story, hit like, share this message to spread it further, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next videos. Don't forget to leave your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for your support.